Payne is going to explain what it created and where we are now 4.5 years later.
So the main thing about the Resilient Rhode Island Act is it creates the Executive Climate Change Coordinating Council. That's the big piece, and everything sort of flows through that mechanism. By codifying an executive order, it didn't change any other provisions of law, nor did it confer any specific powers on the EC4 to do its work. It said, here's the things we expect you to do, but it didn't say, and here's how we empower you to do those things. So it remained purely a coordinating council rather than a council with teeth. That's the first thing to recognize. The other thing is it didn't provide for resources to the council, and thus it had to be done with what I'll call a contributed effort, largely by DEM, and then to some extent by other agencies, significantly OER and the infrastructure bank. But contributed effort is good, but it's not something that gives a body much oomph. So it's done its work for 4 years, and the time is appropriate, coming up on its 5th anniversary, to say, what do we have? What's been accomplished by this? And sometimes, but not always, there's an internal assessment within government called oversight that asks that question, and sometimes it's up to the civic side to pose that. An example of that civic responsiveness to how things work would be Common Cause. Its whole mission was evaluating how things work. Well, the Civic Alliance said, we need to look at how well the EC4 has actually performed. And what we came to realize, it has done some things quite well. It does convene all the state agencies, and that's good because they may not interact and be collegial otherwise, and that's positive because it creates networking among the agencies. It serves as a common platform to push things out to the public, and that's very good. And so that we have a much richer literature now than we did 4 years ago. However, when we look at the statute carefully, what we realize is that the EC4 only used portions of it, large portions, but not all of it. And some of the omissions, the things not utilized, are actually very significant. And what I'll describe as the underlying issue is the continuation of business as usual. The major report on the Greenhouse Gas Emissions Reduction Plan of December 2016 says we can't continue with business as usual. In a way, the EC4 statute, the Resilient Rhode Island Act, said we can't continue with business as usual. However, what we really have going on is building up existing programs as though business as usual will get us there. Now, I'll give you two concrete examples of that. There's an explicit statutory requirement that the EC4 is to issue annual reports by May 1, and those reports are to include findings and recommendations. Now, findings and recommendations are, in fact, a term of practice in writing legislation. And I can say that unequivocally because I've written a great deal of legislation over the course of my career. And findings and recommendations are something a body adopts as here's what we find and here's what we propose should be done. So if you look at the annual reports due by May 1 and never published by that time, do they contain a section of findings and recommendations? No, they don't. No, they don't. Now that's something, they had a lot of homework to do, they were doing a lot of stuff that was valuable, that gave us the rich literature. On the other hand, that thing that would be analytic and say, what do we find about how well things are working and what do we recommend about doing about it, that is relatively well attended to. Another example is that the Science and Technical Advisory Board is supposed to have a chapter in the annual report of the EC4 that engages in evaluation of state policies and programs given current scientific information. The statute has built into it an expectation that that board will give things a hard look based on developments in science, which have been rather robust. There is not an instance in their reports of having done that. The staff. But instead, and having read all the minutes of all the meetings, I can say with some definitiveness, what the staff did was wait for a request from the EC4 and then do the things that EC4 asked it to do. Now, the major example is it did a really tremendous and informative job writing up what was going on in the science that was then put into the infrastructure bank's resilient voting, actionable vision. And so you have this very good report about where things stand on many of the topics in that. But the thing where it says, doing evaluations of policy and programs, not really there. Those are the kinds, now I give you two examples of kinds of things that would challenge business as usual. And that's significant. It becomes increasingly significant going forward. Why is that? Why is it more important going forward than it was previously? Very simply, things were pretty much to be close to the 2020 target of 10% reduction, either a little bit higher or a little bit low, depending on how you count things, but more or less on target. And then it drops like this. The need for reductions increases, and we have to bring them way down. Business as usual keeps them up here. So that those functions that weren't so pressing but desirable at one point in time become an acute need now. That's one of the things that we really say needs to be thought about. Another thing that is become really an extraordinarily significant concern is how we count carbon emissions. That's crucial. And there are two basic ways to do it. And one is talk about carbon emissions that result from a lifestyle in a jurisdiction. a city, a town, a state, a nation. What's the carbon emissions of that lifestyle associated with that lifestyle? And that's what I'll call consumption-based. The other way is how many emissions are produced within that jurisdiction in a year. And you can say that's generation or production-based. People use this production and generation. Some use on one term, some use another, but that's the basic idea. Well, going back to when I was on RGGI, which I served on during the first year of the CACRI administration, I learned that Rhode Island was doing well when we looked at consumption of electricity in our state and how much emissions were generated from that, but not doing well, doing poorly compared to other RGGI states if we look at generation. And that's because we've added to a generation capacity in the natural gas facilities in Burrville and elsewhere in the state. And so our numbers, unlike other RGGI states, actually went up in the generated sector while others went down. And that was because we were the location of new generating capacity. The report, the energy plan that was adopted by the State Planning Council in October 2015 used generation as the basis for looking at emissions.
This is this report here, Energy 2035?
Yep. State Planning Council. This plan, the one adopted by the EC4, looks at consumption of electricity in Rhode Island and what emissions are associated with that. And it picks out electrical consumption as the sole thing it uses for consumption base. So the 2030, Energy 2035 doesn't show us quite making it. The 2016 report shows us making it. Now, that can all be figured out with how we actually do our accounting in 2020, at the end of 2020, which is appropriate. The challenge is, and I'll just use the two documents, this was adopted under the Administrative Procedures Act and has the force of law. But this was adopted by an informal council, not under the Administrative Procedures Act, and its legal standing is a question mark. So, which is it? The one that has the force of law, or the later one that is an informal, in a way, document? This is very significant, both because it tells us about this issue, but the bigger problem is that by only looking at consumption in Rhode Island, that's what this does not do, but what this does for the energy sector alone. But if you were to say, if you were to look at the entirety of consumption in Rhode Island, then we'd have to recognize that our lifestyle has a greater impact on the environment than the emissions that occur within Rhode Island. So that there is a good logic for consumption-based accounting that was partially embraced in this, that can be quite persuasive. So it wasn't necessarily that this is wrong, it's just that you now have two documents that are very close in this time sequence and treat a crucial issue in a differential manner. So we've done that. We've offered this assessment as a way to look constructively about what needs to be done going forward. That's what we wanted to see happen. And we know, as one of the reasons we want to have the press hear and understand this issue, arcane though it may seem, is that we can't make progress unless there's a broad acceptance of the idea that we cannot continue business as usual. And that is a responsibility of the press. It's a responsibility of us on the civic side, and it's a responsibility of government. And so as we look at the underlying idea of this report for Rhode Island, and it says after 2020, business as usual does not work, then as we enter 2019, it's crucial that everyone understand that we're entering a period when business as usual isn't expected to work, and that's where we need to go. So that's how I would characterize what's in this, why we did it, and what we're looking forward to in the next year.